My name is Jose Alvarez. I'm the faculty director of the U.S. Asia Law Institute. This is only the second of our new occasional U.S.-Japan short takes speaker series. And before I introduce today's program, which is on lawyering the Olympics, I want to mention that immediately after today's program, starting at 7 o'clock and going through 8:15 Eastern Standard Time, we have a very exciting program on diplomacy, strategy, and force, managing rising tensions in Taiwan, with an all-star panel of security experts discussing the risk of military conflict and options for keeping the peace in the Taiwan Strait at a time of significant pressure on U.S.-China relations. Most of you know that the presidents of the U.S. and China discussed this very issue just yesterday in their talks, and it will be moderated by the always exciting Jerry Cohen. So stay tuned. That was a separate Zoom link, so you'd have to register separately for that. So today we're going to have a very exciting program with the two lawyers who probably know more about the subject than anybody else in the world. But before that, I wanted to give a chance to Kenju Marukami, who is the Deputy Consul General in the Consulate General of Japan here in New York. He was instrumental in setting up the speaker series on US-Japan, as well as this particular topic, suggesting the speakers that we have today. He's a graduate of the University of Tokyo Law School and has an LLM at the University of Michigan. And I know that for a fact because he was my student at the University of Michigan. He then went to Egypt and served back in Japan on disarmament before returning to the US. So over to you, Kenji.
Thank you, Professor Alvarez, for your kind introduction. As a former law student of Professor Alvarez, I was honored, but at the same time perplexed when I was assigned by the professor to organize a webinar on Olympics. This was indeed a tougher assignment than the ones I struggled with in Michigan Law School. Luckily, my colleague in Tokyo 2020 committee introduced me to Mr. Igarashi, and he kindly accepted it. And he brought in Mr. McCleary. So with the two leading experts of sports law, I'm sure Professor Alvarez will give me an A when it comes to speakers. Held during the pandemic, these games were historic. I commend all those involved for their remarkable work in surmounting considerable challenges to make sure that the games did indeed take place in Japan this summer successfully. As a result, from July 23rd to August 8th, Olympic records were broken, from the number of athletes, approximately 11,000, to the number of medal events, 339. And from August 24th to September 5th, there was a record number of Paralympic athletes, 4,403 participating as well. Japan had envisioned that the games would be to support the recovery of the great earthquake that was devastated by the triple disaster on March 11th, 10 years ago. They were also meant to be a testament to sustainability, with the medals, podiums, and even the athletes' beds made of recycled materials. Though concerns for COVID-19 overshadowed these well-meaning themes, no outbreak occurred because of effective public health protocol and legal safety measures. I'm excited to hear the stories about the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games from the two leading experts of sports laws representing Japan and the US. Their discussion is sure to contribute to the successful hosting of future games and other international sports competitions. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in the Tokyo Games, and I wish Mr. Igarashi and Mr. McCleary a fruitful and stimulating conversation ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let me briefly introduce our two speakers. Mr. Igarashi is a partner at the Japanese law firm TMI Associates. When he's not doing what he's doing now, is intellectual property, sports, entertainment, IT, data protection, media and telecommunications. All of those topics, I suspect, came up in the course of his being the senior director of the legal affairs of the Tokyo Organizing Committee of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And he's been doing that since 2016. In that role, he oversaw all the legal matters, including marketing, contract, intellectual property, data protection, labor, and dispute resolution. He'll be joined by Chris McCleary, who serves as general counsel for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC, and he's done that since January 2015. He leads a team of legal professionals responsible for all USOPC legal, contract, intellectual property, dispute resolution issues, and he serves as the organization's ethics officer and oversees the partnership with the World Anti-Doping Agency, the US Anti-Doping Agency, and the Partnership for Clean Competition. Together, one lawyer helped to organize the games. The other lawyer led the team of with the largest number of athletes, over 1,000 of them. And I think they can present the legal ecosystem that many of us know exists, but have never experienced. So let's start with Mr. Igarashi.
Thank you, Jose. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me today. My name is Atsushi Igarashi, and I'm the Senior Director of Legal Affairs of Tokyo 2020. I'd like to briefly talk about the roles of my legal team and what I did for the Tokyo 2020 Games as lawyers. And I'm going to share my slides. Just a moment, please. Can you see this?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, let's start. Yes, first, I'd like to introduce some figures about the Tokyo 2020 Games. The Olympic Games were held for 16 days this past July and August, and the Paralympic Games were held for 12 days in August. I hope you enjoyed watching the Tokyo 2020 Games on TV or on the internet. The numbers of participating National Olympic Committee, including the refugee team, were 206 in the Olympic Games and 163 in the Paralympic Games. As written in this slide, many athletes participated in the Games. And as you know, the Olympic Games are the largest sporting competition event in the world. Considering the pandemic situation, we are very glad and relieved that we were able to hold the Games safely in Tokyo. Next, I'd like to talk about the organizing committee and our team. The organizing committee, which is called Tokyo 2020, was incorporated in 2014. It started its business with only 44 people, but that number grew to about 7,000 by the time of the Games. In addition to that, we had about 70,000 volunteers for the Games themselves. So we were a very large organization. And with that, there were many legal issues involved. Our legal department has 19 members. 18 attorneys at law and 1 patent attorney. All the members of our legal team were seconded on a part-time basis from a law firm. And with that arrangement, we were able to use the law firm's various legal resources. The legal department does everything related to legal matters. We review all the contracts and provide legal advice to all our functional areas. We also contact the Japanese government to lobby for new laws to be enacted, specifically for the Games. We had some new legislation enacted for the Games, such as the unfair ticket resale prevention law and the laws about tax, drone operations, and radio wave fees. With these new laws, scalping of tickets and the operation of drones over the competition sites were prohibited. And certain taxes and fees of the game's participants were exempted. These were necessary for Tokyo 2020 to comply with the obligations under the host city contract with the IOC. One of our important works is brand protection. We created a brand protection program in cooperation with our brand protection team. We sent many cease and desist letters to infringers of our IP rights and ambush marketing advertisers. We also cooperated with the police and customs to stop the sales and the import of counterfeit products. Dispute resolution is also one of the important roles. But fortunately, there have not yet been any lawsuits so far. We do not provide the game's participants with our legal services. However, we arranged for a pro bono lawyers group with the cooperation of the Japan Bar Association. And they provided the game's participants with pro bono legal services, such as support with the CAS arbitration. CAS held an ad hoc arbitration court in Tokyo during the game's time. This is a list of the functional areas of Tokyo 2020, and there are 52 functional areas: sport, ceremony, broadcast, energy, venues, accommodation, accreditation, communication, finance, brand, sponsorship, ticketing, people management, and so on. I will not go into the details, but I'd like you to know that the legal team has to handle all the legal matters for all of these functional areas. Yeah, it was very tough work. Next, I'd like to refer to the stakeholders of the games. This is an outline of the contractual relationships among the Olympic stakeholders. The most basic and important contract is the host city contract between the IOC and Tokyo 2020. The city of Tokyo and the Japan Olympic Committee are also contracting parties to the HCC. And the host city contract, Tokyo 2020, is authorized to hold the games in Tokyo. The HCC is available on the Tokyo 2020 website, so please look at it if you are interested in it. On the upper left are the top sponsors. Top sponsors are the worldwide sponsors. They pay sponsorship fees to the IOC in consideration for worldwide marketing rights. 14 companies such as Coca-Cola, GE, Visa, Toyota are top sponsors. A part of the sponsorship fees comes to Tokyo 2020 by way of the IOC. On the upper right are the broadcasters. They pay broadcast fees to the IOC for the broadcasting rights, including internet rights. A part of broadcasting fees also come to Tokyo, comes to Tokyo 2020 by way of the IOC. Tokyo 2020 also gets sponsorship fees directly from the domestic sponsors and the sponsorship agreements. We have 81 domestic sponsors, and the total amount of sponsorship fees was the largest in the history of the Olympic Games. In general, a sponsor's marketing rights granted under the sponsorship agreement are exclusive for the product category of the sponsor. However, what is unique about the Tokyo 2020 marketing program was that several sponsors were co-exclusive. For example, Japan Airlines and ANA were the co-exclusive sponsors in the airline category. The bank category and the travel agency category were also co-exclusive. This is because there were many companies that wanted to become sponsors, and we thought it was beneficial for both the sponsors and Tokyo 2020. The marketing revenue, including the broadcasting fees, accounts for more than 75% of the Tokyo 2020's budget. On the middle right are the licensees and the ticket purchases. Tokyo 2020 concluded license agreements with licensees and ticket sales agreements with ticket purchases. To the lower left, Tokyo 2020 creates a lot of creative works for the games, such as the emblems, mascots, look of the games, illustrations, photos, and movies. We have to acquire all the IP rights, such as the copyrights of these creative works, because Tokyo 2020 is required to assign all the IP rights to the IOC and the host city contract. On the lower right, if someone infringes intellectual property rights or conducts ambush marketing, we have to crack down on it. On the upper middle, there are also many NOCs, which are the National Olympic Committees, and IFs, which are international federations of competition, along with the IOC. We needed to accept the delegations safely under the host city contract. Like this, all the stakeholders have their own rights in relation to the games. And Tokyo 2020 has to host the games and accommodate their visit to the games safely. The coordination of the rights and obligations of these stakeholders is one of the difficult tasks of Tokyo 2020. However, in addition to these very heavy preparatory works, it became necessary to take measures against COVID-19 at the Tokyo Games. Also, as you know, we faced many difficult situations in relation to the pandemic. First, we postponed the games from 2020 to 2021. It was the first time the games were postponed in the history of the Olympics. Second, although we postponed the games with the hopes of being able to hold the games with full spectators, unfortunately, we decided to hold the games without any spectators, given the situation at the time. And third, we had to take various kinds of countermeasures against COVID-19 to secure the health and the safety of all the participants during the games. This included the reduction of the number of the stakeholder participants. We therefore had to completely change our original plan. And in terms of legal matters, there were many tasks, such as the amendment of existing contracts and the execution of new contracts. It was as if we had to do again in 1 year what we had been preparing for in 7 years. Due to these countermeasures, the number of participants were significantly reduced. The number of participants other than athletes were reduced from the originally planned 141,000 to 33,000 for the Olympic Games, and from 36,000 to 10,000 for the Paralympic Games. We could not implement such reductions without the understanding and support of all the NLCs, IFs, and other related parties. And before the COVID-19 pandemic, Olympic tickets were very popular. And more than 8,650,000 tickets were sold before the pandemic. And more tickets were expected to be sold worldwide. Unfortunately, we decided to hold the games with no spectators due to the pandemic. And in the end, we decided to hold the games with no spectators and in the end, we were able to accept only 43,000 spectators. And these spectators were for venues that were not located in the Tokyo metropolitan area. Due to this decision, we had to refund the remaining 8,600,000 plus tickets that had been sold. I think this is the largest refund project in the history of sports events. This is the outline of our countermeasures against COVID-19 during the games. As I have explained, we reduced the number of participants. In March 2021, we decided not to accept spectators from overseas and made efforts to reduce the number of participants of stakeholders. And we finally decided on holding the games with no spectators in July. In addition, we implemented strict behavioral management. We drafted a playbook for each stakeholder, such as athletes and officials, marketing partners, broadcasters, and workforce. And the playbook sets out the behavioral rules for each type of stakeholders before their entry into Japan, at the time of entry, during their stay, and at the time of departure. For example, participants were not allowed to leave the Olympic Village, competition venues, and other permitted places in the bubble. They were not allowed to use public transportation, such as trains and buses, and they were not allowed to eat out. They had to eat in the Olympic Village, and they had to take PCR tests every day. If they tested positive, they could not participate in the competition. However, there were a few people who violated the rules. When we found such persons, we decided on penalty for the violation in consultation with the IOC. There were 18 cases of deprivation of accreditation and 10 cases of suspension of accreditation. Most of these cases were due to drinking alcohol outside the permitted places. However, it was the NLCs who actually had to manage the activities of their athletes. So I think the NLCs had a lot of trouble managing their athletes and having them comply with the playbook during the games. I feel bad that the athletes and the related parties could not leave the Olympic Village or their hotels during their stay in Japan. There are many fantastic restaurants and attractions in Tokyo, and I wanted them to enjoy all of Tokyo. I also feel bad that the Japanese people did not have the opportunity to interact with these fantastic athletes and other participants of the games. This is a photo of the Olympic Village, and the buildings in the foreground are the Olympic Village buildings. In consideration of sustainability, these buildings were built with the intent of being renovated and used as general residences. Finally, I'd like to explain the remaining work for our legal department. First, as I explained just before, under the host city contract, Tokyo 2020 has to assign all the IP rights to the works made for the games to the IOC. We are going to execute a deed of assignment for this purpose. We are currently making a list of the works, the intellectual property rights of which we are assigning to the IOC. This list includes more than 5,000 items, and we need to prepare the chain of title documents for each item. This is very painstaking work. Second, we have to take care of legal disputes, if any. As I mentioned before, fortunately, we have not had any lawsuits so far. I hope we can proceed with the dissolution process of Tokyo 2020 without any lawsuits. And of course, we have to complete the dissolution process, which is planned to be completed next year. Hopefully, all this procedure will proceed smoothly. That's it. I hope you found this to be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we turn to Mr. McCleary, I wanted to remind those who are joining in, at any time, you can write in your questions in the Q&A box. As moderator, I will take them up so that we should have time for your questions. So let's proceed, Mr. McCleary.
Thanks, Jose, and thanks so much for that strong lead, Atsushi. I think I would say I'll try to keep this brief, because I think if you looked at the slide among Mr. Igarashi's slides, the chart slide, you saw all those boxes and all the arrows and all the colors that are involved in this, and I think that it's an excellent visual aid for this whole discussion. And again, I'll try to keep it brief, but what I wanted to talk about is what's built around the experience that Atsushi was talking about when you're trying to put on the games. Because I will tell you, in light of all of those, all of the people involved in all the relationships, and in light of the circumstances that pertained in Tokyo, it was an act of extraordinary commitment and dedication and persistence and energy and courage to put on the games the way that organizers did in Tokyo and to succeed at that level. It was really, really amazing. And I think on his chart, you'll remember, he depicted the organizing committee in the center of the chart, and I would put them in the same place, because ultimately the true expression of this Olympic and Paralympic movement is the conduct of the games. But let me tell you who's around it and what it and where I fit on that chart, if I can, for a moment. And I'm going to speak about the Olympics and the International Olympic Committee. Let's put a pin in the Paralympics for a moment, because it's a very similar story, not quite identical, but very similar. But just to keep the conversation simple, let's talk about the ecosystem that created the circumstance for the hosting of the games. At the center of it is any city that is awarded the right to host the games, as Tokyo was. And they create an organizing committee. And that's where Atsushi was leading the legal team. But the people that give that grant are at the top of this world, and that's the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, right? Which is a nonprofit sport entity based in Europe. They created this movement, as they call it, the movement, this whole, the whole construct we're talking about, when they created the Olympic Charter, as it's called. And the Olympic Charter is a document you can find on ioc.org and look at. And if you have any interest in this world, I will recommend it to you, because it's not only, it's kind of the constitution of the entire Olympic movement, it's also a clear and pretty concise statement of the values on which this whole thing was meant to be built. It's very interesting. So anyway, they create the construct, and then they award the right to host the games in 2020 and in 2024 and in 2026. And then they work in each case with a different organizing committee and the country which has won the right to host. So this is one of the fundamental things I would point out. I'm always smiling when I say, well, I work at the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And then people are talking about, that sounds fun. You work for the Olympics. What's it like working in the Olympics? How do they do this at the Olympics? And Atsushi will tell you, there is no the Olympics. There is a very complex network of players and parties. And again, thinking of his chart, you saw all of the players that he had to navigate amongst. And even in creating the so-called movement, the same is true, where you have the IOC at the very top of this. And I don't have any charts. I apologize for this. Instead of slides, I have only elaborate hand gestures. So here I go. So you have the IOC running this show. Then you have a column of international federations. And these are the international sport organizations that lead each sport, which makes up part of the Olympics. And what happens when the IOC awards the games to Tokyo is then the organizers in Tokyo have to work with the IOC and each of these IFs to put on the event in that IF's sport. So those are also multinational nonprofit sport organizations for volleyball and for field hockey and for track and field. And part of organizing the games is working with all of those different sports. But then there's an entirely separate column, and this is where I live, in the National Olympic Committees. And you saw Atsushi's slide, 206. And this column are the competitors. So the Tokyo Organizing Committee has the right and then puts on the games. And I will tell you that having given them that right, the IOC, and again, Atsushi will correct me if this is not true, the IOC essentially leaves this to Tokyo to figure it out and to work with all of these IFs and to negotiate the venue arrangements and the way the athletes will be treated and what the rules will be. And then to negotiate with each of the 206 teams that are coming, of which I am only one. And so you saw that at the US OPC, we brought, I think, what was the largest or second largest delegation. We had more than 1,200 human beings go to Tokyo, even under these restrictive circumstances, with more than 600 athletes competing. And so a thing that I did in advance of, some years in advance of the Tokyo Games, was reach out to Atsushi and say, hey, can we meet? I just want you to know who I am because I'm bringing a whole bunch of people to this thing, and it's going to be my responsibility to make sure they behave. So if I can just use that as a shorthand, that's where I fit in this whole construct. So the IOCs creates this ecosystem in which we all live, and really does put, I think, the organizers in the center of that thing. But if you see us as one of the NOCs, and this is the last thing I'll say about the ecosystem, in the US, we are a very odd duck among the 206. We're really the only one that operates in quite the way we do, and it's a very American way. And it makes us interesting and sometimes challenging in the international sphere for the other parties to understand and interact with. That's because instead of being an arm of the government or publicly funded, what happened when the US government decided to get the then US Olympic Committee organized was they passed a piece of federal legislation, very American strategy. It's called the Ted Stevens Olympic. Now it's called the Ted Stevens Olympic, Paralympic, and Amateur Sports Act. And what that law says, that US federal law says, there's going to be this committee. They're going to decide when the US will seek to host the games. They will be in cooperation when that happens. They will field the team to go to all the other games in the world that are being hosted. They will recognize and now certify national governing bodies for each sport. And those are we've got 55 of these, and each of them lines up across the columns to an IF. So I have a USA Volleyball National Governing Body. They are a member of the International Federation for Volleyball. So I'm the guy at the USOPC that certifies all of those national organizations. Again, lots of relationships involved in this. But instead of giving me federal or public money, what that law says is, I'm going to give you very extraordinarily strong rights around the rings and the word Olympic and the word Paralympic and the Paralympic symbol, the Agitos. Nobody else can use them. This goes past regular trademark law. I don't have to prove that people are being confused if someone uses a thing that looks like the Olympic rings. I only have to say Ted Stevens Act, and the court is there for me. That's a really uniquely powerful device under US law. And so they said, I'm giving you this great right, so go make money with it. You need to attract sponsors and donors. And that's how you will feed yourself, is I'm teaching you to fish instead of giving you a fish, if that makes sense. So that strange construct where Congress gave me the exclusive rights to the rings sometimes makes the people at the IOC a little bit cross because it's their rings, not mine and not Congress's, to give it to me. So what do you mean? Congress gave you this right. I will recognize you as one of the 206 National Olympic Committees or not. Over the years, we've navigated that together. We have a very strong partnership on that basis. But that's one of the reasons I always want to reach out to somebody in Atsushi's role and say, hey, just want you to know me. I may be challenging. I bring a whole bunch of people. I act a little bit differently than some of the other competitors do in this thing from an organizational perspective. And it makes it a really interesting job for us and to deal with us. And that's where I'll end. But this is where I bring it to this construct to when we think about international relations, international law. I think, and I'm interested in what others think about this, but I think if we take the Olympic movement and think of Paralympic movement too, it is uniquely lined up against international relations issues. I don't think there's another sporting event that lines up so directly or so impactfully against this. Because when Atsushi needs to put on a games, what he's doing is he's agreeing to host 206 countries in his country and subject to the laws that he is subject to. And according to rules that some of which are impressed upon him, some of which he has to create. And he has to invite athletes from all these countries to compete fairly on agreed rules, vigorously, They don't have to be friends. They don't have to agree with each other's political or ideological approaches to the world. And it goes without saying that there are widely varying approaches politically among the countries from which these competitors come. But sport and the Olympic movement demands that all of the people that come put those aside, accept the Olympic principles that I talked about in the charter, accept the rules that we've set and the rules of their sport, and compete and bond as human beings in one place at one time. So as I finish that kind of, obviously this is a semester class, not an hour, but as we talk about this construct, generally, that dynamic, and we can be cynical about the money involved in the different ways sport works. It is a uniquely, I think it's a really highly aspirational and laudable goal. The principles underlying it of putting aside differences, particularly when it comes to politics. You know, there's an Olympic truce usually where the countries who are involved in armed conflicts are asked to stop during the period of the games. There's just nothing else like that for people trying to bridge gaps internationally and work together internationally. So that's why I say, you know, I look at Atsushi, I look at the work that they did, and it was thankless work in 2021. There were people that just wanted to call the whole thing off, and I salute their resolve in making it happen, because I will tell you, as a person who was in Tokyo for both of those games, and though it was so sad that the magnificent venues and all the terrific volunteers saw so few of us visiting from other countries, they delivered 100% on the experience. And I saw athletes from different countries meeting each other on that field of play, meeting volunteers from Japan, and connecting as human beings in a way that you just can't do any other way. So that's why I'm so enthusiastic about the world that we live in.
Point. Let me give you both a chance to interact. If there's a question you want to pose to one another, starting with Mr. McCleary, you want to pose any questions that were left unanswered in your relationship from the Tokyo Games?
Thank you for that. And I sure do. I'll just do one for now, because as you were talking, Atsushi, I was thinking of a number of questions about your own personal experience, but here's one.
Yeah.
We talked about the organizer of the Olympics is really at the center of this universe during the games. They're celebrating the games and helping us do that. Every country that hosts the games is at the same moment a participant in those games, because it has a National Olympic Committee competing. And Japan competed very successfully at the games in Tokyo. And every games is different in terms of how the organizers in that country and the team that participates in that country, are they related? Are they completely separate? Are they tied together? How do they work together? I'm interested in how that worked in Tokyo from your experience.
Yeah, yes, thank you for your question. And I think the Tokyo 2020 Organizing Committee, the relationship, for example, the relationship, I'd like to talk about the relationship between the JOC and the Tokyo 2020. Basically, Tokyo 2020 is responsible for hosting the games, and we are adjusting the rights and obligations of many NOCs and many participants. And JOC is responsible for the Japan delegation. And the members of JOC is a part of our executive board, and they are they have a they are very we usually consult with JOC in deciding what is very important, but basically we are taking care of the organization of the games, and JOC is responsible for the athletes. And as Chris said, it was very tough work for us to communicate with each NOCs and other participants. And yeah, for example, there are many NOCs and athletes, and there are many broadcasters and media. So it was very difficult work for us to communicate with those participants.
Well, yeah, I made the point about, sorry, Jose, just, and I'll stop, but I was making the point about nothing like the Olympics juxtaposes with international relations quite the same way, because you have all of those countries and all of those sports and all of those people together at the same time. And the degree to which that creates issues depends on who is hosting the games and what's happening geopolitically involving that country or other countries. And so, I mean, we can talk about different games and different games hosts, but I felt like in the case of Tokyo Games, those pressures and the difficulties were fairly low, because Japan is a country that is on fairly good terms with a great majority of the other countries of that. I didn't see people making each other uncomfortable politically at the Tokyo Games, at least from my perspective. But how did it feel from the inside? Were there concerns? Were there instances where you had to worry about whether countries were getting along okay?
Yeah, I think, of course, I think there were many contradictions or disputes among those parties, but as an organizing committee, we don't talk about such matters internally. And I think it's a kind of matters that is handled by the Japanese government or other political organizations, I think.
So do you have any questions, Mr. Aragashi, for Chris?
Yes, I have a question about the preparation stage of the National Olympic Committee. And I think you have experiences in participating in many past games. And what is the most difficult task for the general, the lawyers for the USOPC for the preparation of the participation in the games?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say, I think different countries may have different experiences. For us, from games in and games out, we have a lot of challenges just around logistics, because we're bringing so many people in a delegation to an event at a time. So getting 1,200 people organized and getting their credentials and arranging for lodging and handling all the ticket requests and the suppliers for food and training materials and all those things in each country, games after games, is just a lot of legal work ahead of time. I felt for you all when the games were postponed, it was sort of blew my mind thinking of how many contracts you were going to have to open back up and try to renegotiate. And the same was happening to us on a tiny fraction of the scale. And for us, it was a lot of work with sponsors and vendors and all of those contract works. I think that's where our lawyers spend so much time at every games, and never so much as Tokyo. But for me, I couldn't even imagine how you all could begin to even deal with the number of agreements that you must have had to rework.
When we decided on the postponement of the games, there were more than, I think, 5,000 existing agreements, and we were at a loss. And we make a plan to renegotiate the agreements, and we extended the agreement. And sometimes we had to execute some extra MOU or small amendment agreements and so on. And of course, all the contracting party are happy about that postponement. Rather, they are very angry at the postponement, and they want us to compensate for the additional costs. And that negotiation for cost bearing was very tough negotiation. And we, and of course, for example, regarding the Olympic Village, and that village buildings will be sold to general public the next year, and some residents had been sold, so we had to negotiate with the buyers of that building. So it was very tough, and some venues were booked for 2021 by other competition organizations. So it was very complicated work and very tough work.
Interesting. So one question I really think both of you are in an excellent posture to give is advice. So assume you are giving advice to the Beijing Olympics. What would you say you want to tell them that you have learned either from hosting the games or on your side, Chris, from being on the side of the athletes on this? Any advice to give? They're probably starting to work on it if they haven't for the past 5
For me,
months.
I think so.
Yeah, so for me, I recommend that they will look at the termination clause and the force majeure clause of the agreements. Everything happens. Usually lawyers look at the termination clause and the force majeure clause as a boilerplate template. But yeah, we have to look at it carefully. Yeah, for the pandemic or something really unusual happens. So yeah, it's advice from me.
That's got to be the most important thing. And it's really the most important example of what I would advise anyone getting ready to put on the games, at least in the nearer term. And that's Beijing. And we know that they're well down the road planning. But I would hope that they would learn all they can from the Tokyo experience. And that force majeure clause is an example of that. But also, I mean, my impression, and again, I don't know how it felt from the inside, Atsushi, but the creation of the playbooks, the COVID safety approach, was a first in a lifetime effort. There's no one ever had to put together something quite like that before. And I saw the work, at least from the outside. I saw how much work went into it. I saw it sharpen and sharpen as the games got closer. And I saw it, and I hope you don't mind me saying it, I saw during the early days of the games, I saw operational difficulties with it, which are inevitable because no one has ever tried to do this before. And I saw adjustments being made so that by the end of the Olympics, I really felt like you all had kind of almost solved an insolvable problem. And then when we came back for the Paralympics, everything was just clicking along. It was no problem at all. So I hope that the Chinese authorities are making a very close study of where you ended up on that.
And that's the playbook that you mentioned, Chris, that accompanies this, which sounds like what made this particular playbook was the COVID protocols. And should I take that to mean that the playbook otherwise doesn't vary all that much depending on the host? You've been through this before, right, in different hosts. Is that accurate?
It is accurate because in the normal course, the operational difficulties are very consistent from games to games. The approach to solving those difficulties can vary by the organizer, which is the interest of this, because every country and every organizing committee has its own approach, but it's mostly the same set of problems. This was unprecedented in all ways.
Now, you mentioned, Chris, that one of your jobs is to keep the athletes to adhere to the playbook. Is that a hard job? Or don't they have every motivation on earth to stay within the rules?
I would say the answer to that is yes. They should have every motivation. This is, at some point, and I'm not a math person, that's why I went to law school, but at some point, I think when you just get past a certain number of people, the probabilities are such that you can't get 1,200 people to do everything the same way and according to the same rules, even if they're trying. And so it is still a challenge. If you think of being an elite athlete in today's world of sport and competing internationally the way they do and traveling, at least during competition season, extensively, these aren't people that, like me, are sitting at a desk and studying playbooks all day. They are running from one thing to another. They're depending on entourages and support people to tell them what they need to know, and then they execute on it. They're moving fast. And so it is a challenge, I think, breaking through the sort of the noise level and making sure that we connect with each and every one of those athletes. And I think for us, that's a problem because there are so many athletes. For some of the 206, remember, these are a number of these NOCs are very small countries with limited resources and not even all the communications resources they would like. So I think every attendee of the games in a moment like this faces challenges getting full compliance.
Drafting of a playbook was very challenging. For example, it provides that athletes cannot use public transportation. Yeah, it's a rule. But how can they move from the Olympic Village to the competition venues? Yeah, we have to prepare for the transportation method. So we planned our bus plans for the athletes and the participants. So, and we have to bear the cost of additional bus arrangement. And that's a very tough question. So it's not a matter of making rules, but we have to prepare for another systems to work the Olympic Games.
So we
Great
have
point.
just a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I do want to encourage people to put them in, but I can't resist asking sort of an obvious question. So it's been reported yesterday in the Washington Post, I believe, that the Biden administration may attempt a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Games, which is described as the politicians don't go, but the athletes do. Others have called for a more thorough boycott by the United States or others for this. Do you, Chris, or Mr. Igarashi, have a reaction to boycotting the games diplomatically or through the athletes?
Yeah, Atsushi, if you don't mind if I go first. Remember, I was drawing my columns, and I'm on this column of National Olympic Committees. My mission, my whole mission, is to promote sustained competitive excellence and wellness for our Team USA athletes. So I need to take them to every games. If I believe in the Olympic values and the value of the Olympics, then my desire for these athletes to have that moment and that chance is not dependent on who's hosting the games or what geopolitical issues might be rising at that time. So I will say, and people will forgive me for being biased, but I have a very strong bias against putting athletes and sport in a position where it's being asked to solve geopolitical problems. I think in our lifetime, at least old folks like me, we saw that attempted to be put into play in the 1980 games when the Carter administration in the US boycotted the Moscow Olympics, and there was some subsequent boycott activity from other countries in the subsequent Los Angeles games in 1984. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who were selected to the 80 team or the 84 team for those other countries, and the pain that that boycott brought to those people. And I think we can all agree, and even political experts agree, those boycotts made no impact geopolitically or on human rights issues or anything else. So I won't take a position on governments and how they relate to each other, but I hate anything that puts the athletes in the middle.
Mr. Igarashi, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, and I'm just a member of the Tokyo 2020 organizing committee, so I'm afraid I'm not in a position to comment on that question. Sorry.
So let me turn to at least a couple of the questions. This is from a journalist who was at the 1988 Games in Korea and the 2008 Games in Beijing, where they helped to organize for the Associated Press. I'd like to thank you for the presentations. And one question, though, is there was a lot of ambush marketing at those games. In Korea, a lot of accredited photographers had to give up their photo jackets in the middle of the games because they had a logo that violated somebody's IP rights. I'm interested to know what the most interesting or outrageous ambush marketing attempt you saw at the Tokyo Games. And I think that's directed at you, Mr. Igarashi.
Yes, thank you for the question. Before the pandemic, we thought that brand protection was the most difficult and tough issue for the Tokyo 2020. And we made an anti-ambush marketing program. And we tried to make new law regarding anti-ambush marketing, but there is an objection from the economic sector in Japan, and the Japanese government didn't make a new law regarding ambush marketing. So I think I thought it was going to be a very difficult issue for us. But as I told you, we didn't have any spectators due to the pandemic, and there are no spectators around the venues. And I thought, as a result, there have not been any serious ambush marketing activities. So of course there are some minor ambush marketing activities such as small advertisement and counterfeit product sales. But every time we found those activities, we sent cease and desist letters and messages within 24 hours, and it was very successful. And I think, we did, was very successful about the anti-ambush marketing.
So there is a follow-up question on that. Can you give examples of the kinds of works that are protected under copyright, other than, say, souvenirs? What other things are IP protected that come out of the games?
I think the counterfeit medal was there. There are many counterfeit medals tried to import it from other Asian countries. So we stopped the import of many gold medals, counterfeit medals. And of course, there are many items bearing the emblems and mascots of our Olympic Games, and we successfully stopped those products.
So I guess we're running very close to time, but I guess there may be some students here who want to become what you are on both sides. And I guess the question is, what advice would you give them as to the important skills that a lawyer would have to do what each of you does, right? I mean, what is it that makes you successful in your job? Let's start with Mr. Aragoshi.
Yep, I think I'd like to raise 3 points. First, the wide vision, and second is a sense of balance, and third is the communication skills. Yeah, as you know, we have we as an organizing committee had to communicate all the FAs, all the stakeholders. So we have to have wide vision and a sense of balance, and we have to communicate well with those people.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, that's a really good summary. I'll tell you from the US perspective, a thing that we often talk about, and I wish people had told me when I was in law school, because I at that time I felt like I had a real interest in sports law. And what we all sort of say to each other now often is there is no sports law. There's law and it's applied to sports. So what I would suggest people work on, if you would like to sort of hold a senior position in the world of sport as a legal professional, is establish a broad base of expertise so that you can bring legal value to different kinds of conversations and problems. So understand contracts and understand a little bit of IP and understand litigation, these things. But then marry that with, and this takes time to cultivate, a real passion for the mission or the aim of a particular segment of sport. So I was talking about, what's so exciting to me about the Olympic movement. I used to work as a lawyer at Visa Inc., which is a payments company, but the part of their business that I got involved in was sponsorship and advertising. And I gravitated slowly towards this mission. So having the mission in your heart and having it be a thing that really excites you and makes you enthusiastic and effective, and then marry that with technical legal skills.
And it also sounds from both of you that you have to be a people person. That is, this is a job that really demands attention to a great number of shareholders of various kinds and stockholders as well. And in your case, Chris, a lot of athletes from very different backgrounds, some very young ones, I dare say. So you have to be able to explain the playbook, get them to adhere it, and perhaps appeal to different aspects of their personality, depending on knowing who they are. And I assume you get to know these athletes fairly well over time, right? So you must know them from even a prior Olympic event, I assume, right?
It is the most humbling thing about the work that I do is these athletes and what they have committed in their area of endeavor. And so, yes, it's been my honor to get to know a number of athletes, but I will tell you, it's humbling for anybody else. If whoever is listening in right now, and I'm looking at you and Atsushi, we are hardworking people that try hard to be good at what we do. You can't imagine the level of commitment and sacrifice these people are putting out. So we owe them everything.
Well, that sounds like a good place to end, unless Mr. Agashi, you have any closing comments?
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. Yeah, it was very great. And I think we have some remaining tasks, so we will do our best. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. And I just want to alert the audience, there's another program starting soon on Taiwan. And thank you very much for this. I think it's the first time the US Asia Institute has addressed this topic, and I hope it won't be the last. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.